Annee. I am the president of Colera. I want to thank you for joining us today. This monthly topic is on speech and off-duty conduct. We have made application with the Supreme Court for CLEs, so throughout the presentation, you'll be receiving notifications to verify your attendance for the Supreme Court. Now, today our speaker is attorney Annee Duprey. Annee focuses her practice on the representation of employers in a broad spectrum of labor and employment matters, including employment litigation, traditional labor work, and advising employers on day-to-day personnel issues. Annee is a regular speaker on labor and employment trends, discrimination and harassment issues, and best employment practices. She also provides ongoing education and training to many clients and organizations like us so that we can make informed decisions with confidence. I will upload her bio in the chat, and Annee, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Great, good morning for several more seconds, everyone. It is nice to see all of you. Can everyone hear me okay? I think we're good. Okay, it's good to see some friendly faces. I presented to this group last year. I have a tendency to keep presenting as a substitute for Kat Burgett. If you all know Kat, she and I joke that we're mostly interchangeable. And the presentation that we're going to give today is a presentation that Kat and I gave earlier this year. And it went over really, really well with the audience. We were presenting to a group of HR professionals, and we found that it's a really great presentation to stir a lot of conversation. And that's what we're hoping that will come from today's presentation with all of you. Kat couldn't be here today, so you get me. This is intended to be interactive. There is what I like to think is the longest but most interesting hypothetical at the end. And I think we can all learn a lot from one another with the varying perspectives that we have here in our meeting. We've got the union side, we have management side, we have mediators. I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives. So please don't hesitate to speak up, shout out. I do not get flustered when interrupted. So just like, let's have a good dialogue for the next hour. So this presentation is Sticks and Stones, Words and Actions Matter. If I can figure out how to change my slides, that would help. There we go. Okay. So once upon a time, we lived in a world where employers just really didn't know what employees did when they left the office. I've got Ron Livingston here from Office Space, for those of you who are Office Space fans. And while he was truly miserable while he was at work, his employer didn't necessarily know what was happening when he left. Now, thanks to the advent of social media, I have this picture on the right of Ron Livingston, something that was pulled off of the internet. Heavens only knows what he's doing. I think it was a movie set of some sort, but nonetheless, it demonstrates the point that now we get to see everything that our employees do, particularly when their social media accounts are not private. I know in our small group, we were talking about how many folks have a social media presence. For those of you in today's meeting, could you raise your hand or wave if you have a social media account? Anyone? A few? Yeah. Yeah, I see like almost half or so have a social media account. I know I personally have a social media account, but when I was one of the early adopters of social media because I was a freshman in college in 2004 when Facebook started. So I had Facebook like right out of the gate. I was also went to school to be a teacher. So when I did my student teaching by my senior year of college, I had removed what I thought to be everything that could possibly reflect poorly upon me. And while I ended up going the law school route, I never switched my social media back. And when I looked to see my top 9 Instagram posts for 2021, I did not have 9. That's how infrequently I post on those sorts of things, but I enjoy looking at it. But I know I am very careful about what I put on there. And today we don't just have Facebook and Instagram. And I think a lot of where we are seeing more issues in the employment context is Snapchat. So messages that disappear, and employees can take pictures of stuff in the workplace and they Snapchat it to their coworkers, or they Snapchat messages among coworkers, and then those disappear. Those are harder to capture. You also have TikTok, which is like a wild craze where folks are making videos people are dancing at work and making TikTok videos. So you see things like that happening both in and outside of the workplace. And then you have LinkedIn, which I probably post the most on LinkedIn, and I don't even post a whole lot there. But you see less issues arising out of LinkedIn. So 2020 was a doozy. We had the pandemic, racial and social justice issues, the tumultuous political climate in 2020, the attacks on AAPI communities, cancel culture. And then 2021 was really no better. It was kind of a continuation of all of the same. And here we are in 2022. And with everything that was going on in the world in 2020, 2021, and 2022, we've seen social media take on a new light, both from an advocacy perspective and this cancel culture perspective that has a huge impact on employees, both within the workplace and outside the workplace. So when we talk about on and off duty conduct, we're looking at a variety of things. So social media activity is one of the biggest things. What can employees do with social media on and off work? What they can do and can't do really depends a lot on the employer's policies. Does the employer have a social media policy that restricts employees from posting while at work? Those policies are usually okay. When you start getting into restricting the content of what an employee posts off work duty, that's when things start to get a little dicey. In general, the National Labor Relations Board, and some of you can probably speak better to me about CERB's opinion on these things, but for the most part, a policy that tells employees they're not allowed to post on social media because they're supposed to be working, that's going to be okay. A policy that says, hey, you can't post for the company unless you're authorized to do so, that's going to be okay. The content is when it gets a little bit different. And as I'm sure most of you know, there are differences for public sector versus private sector employees, because that sneaky First Amendment comes in. So those are all things that employers should be focusing on, and employees and the union should really understand what are the employer's policies and how are we advising our employees on those issues. Something that really came out in 2020 was, what about attendance at protests and rallies? So, in 2020, there were a lot of demonstrations here in Columbus. My office looks down on the State House, so I got to watch a lot of what was going on. And there were issues of, well, can an employee take time off for that? They can take PTO for whatever reason they want to take PTO. Should employers be offering time for folks to go to demonstrations? I know some employers have adopted policies like that. But then what about what happens when there are pictures of your employee that come up on social media of their activities at a rally that may not align with your company values? This really came to light in part in 2020, but then January 6th of 2021, there was a lot more of this. And we saw a lot of it, displayed publicly in the news about folks that had been at the Capitol, inside the chambers of Capitol, and those individuals losing their jobs. I know I got a call from from an employer who said, one of our employees is on the FBI's most wanted list. That's a call I never really expected to get when I started practicing. But those are things that employers are having to deal with now and navigate that. Have any of you had any issues with things popping up on social media about an employee who is engaging in conduct that the employer does not approve of at a protest, a rally, anything like that? I'm the only one.
I had to recommend for an employee to take down some pictures that somebody called me about on their social media. It's like, take it down immediately.
Yeah, just don't post it. Is there common sense training? I think we should start implementing common sense training with human resources. Like, what are you doing? Just you don't need to post it. But we also had issues with messaging on clothing and masks. So some employers had no policies relating to messages on clothing and masks. And then in 2020 and in 2021, you started getting people coming to work wearing black back the blue shirts or Black Lives Matter masks, or trying to think of an appropriate way to say the like F the police masks. And we saw a lot of those things coming into the workplace, and then employers were scrambling of, oh, we didn't actually have a policy on that. And what can our policy be? Like, how much speech can we limit? You know, for the most part, neutral policies are going to be fine. Of, we don't allow employees to come to work with any, text on their mask or their clothing. You know, here's what we expect. Kat and I have done a couple presentations on this, and this started before 2020, but has only gotten more important, I think, which is addressing workplace civility and safety. You know, there are a lot of, there's a lot of training on harassment and discrimination in the workplace. There's less training on just being nice to one another. And unfortunately, part of the culture developed in large part because of social media is this impression among employees and management alike that you can kind of say whatever you want to say, particularly online, and there are no consequences for it. And you can hide behind your screen and be a bully, and it's okay. And that has trickled off the screens into real life as well. I mean, we kind of communicate in a really weird way these days. So implementing some training on that sort of thing. It may not be a violation of Title VII to be an equal opportunity bully, but it doesn't mean that it's okay either. So that's another thing that we've seen a lot of, both on and off duty. With on and off duty conduct, there's also a lot of issues with leave and time off that have come up. We had a lot of instances where employees would take a sick day and then they would appear on social media doing something that is contrary to their alleged sickness, or they took FMLA leave, but social media showed us they weren't actually, needing to take that FMLA for that reason. So those are some of the other things that we've seen, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the laws that are implicated with all of this on and off duty conduct. So we have National Labor Relations Act and the state equivalent, Title VII, ADA, FMLA, OSHA. We also get into the laws regarding political activity and privacy and free speech protections. So again, I know we have a fair number of folks here that are deal a lot with public sector employees, and those laws relating to political activity and privacy and free speech protections really come up a lot. Now, if any of you work with multi-state employers, or then some of those laws related to political activity and privacy do change. I mean, there are a handful of states that have very specific laws related to political activity in the workplace or outside the workplace, and protections from discrimination on the basis of that political activity. So just something to keep in mind if you're ever in a scenario where you're dealing with someone outside of Ohio. Hey, I'm on the board of the Human Resources Association of Central Ohio, and it's something that I've reiterated to the board and our members numerous times is, man, it is tough to be in HR in the last couple of years. There's a lot going on. They have a lot on their plate. Human resources professionals went maybe from handling onboarding and payroll and occasional discipline to being the public relations department, the training department, the AEP or EAP, and like the armchair lawyers. So the things that human resources professionals have been working on to address some of these on-duty and off-duty conduct issues are revising the policies, creating brand new policies. So much has changed in the last 2 years, particularly with respect to working remotely and having hybrid workplaces, that employers are creating brand new policies. The laws have been changing over and over. You know, in 2020, we had the extension of the FMLA and the FFCRA. And we're continuing to see things change with OSHA and masking and everything. So navigating all of that is a lot. Developing training for employees is really important, and we have seen an uptick in employers developing training centered a little bit more along the lines of that workplace civility that I was talking about, and just trying to teach people to be nice to each other again, and how to have productive dialogue. I had a lot of discussions with HREPO and with other organizations that a lot of companies have invested time in revamping their EAP, their employer assistance program. I don't know if any of you had seen this, but some have started to revamp their EAPs to provide more benefits to family members of the employee as well as the employee. And that stemmed from, the mental health issues have skyrocketed since 2020. People weren't used to being around their spouse 24/7, and suddenly they were shut in a house with their spouse and their children, and everyone was trying to work and go to school at the same time. And it's really mentally taxing, and it caused a lot of issues. So I know there are a fair number of employers that have revised their EAP to provide benefits to family members to really help employees strengthen their mental health and have opportunities, setting them up for more success. I've also seen a lot more corporate affinity groups started. You see a lot of Black at Work groups, LGBTQ groups, and Asian American groups at work, so that folks have a safe place at work where they can talk about issues that are happening in current events, how they can be more productive and proactive at work to change policies. So we're seeing a lot of those develop as well. And then HR is also working on developing a lot of the internal and external communications. I feel like there was a lot of PR that went on in 2020 and 2021 as companies learned how to respond to and make press statements about what was going on outside of work and how that was impacting their employees, and trying to support employees to say, hey, we're here for you, and we know that things in the world are crazy right now, be it the pandemic, be it social justice, be it your spouse working at home with you all the time. So talking a little bit more about off-duty conduct and some of the things that we've seen, some of the things we've seen spill from the outside into the workplace. So social media posts, which we've talked about. Taking a knee during a national anthem seems to be one of the favorite lunchtime arguments that employees have, where they talk about, well, I just don't think anyone should ever kneel when the national anthem is being played, and I don't care who you are, you don't do that. That's not the way you do things. That was a huge source of workplace disputes over the last couple of years. And that's just one example of one thing going on out in the outside world that spilled into the inside. We talked a little bit about the protests, and then we get to kind of complaints about coworkers' off-duty conduct. So when we think about the complaints, it's one of the things that really sparks a lot of the employer's involvement, is because it is less likely that an employer is sitting there going through every employee's social media account, but is more likely that an employee comes to an employer and says, oh, can you believe that this person posted this, and I am so offended, and I think this reflects poorly upon our company, and that's how things get rolling inside the workplace. Or someone sees it and they don't go to HR, but they go to their coworker and say, hey, did you see what Joe was doing this weekend? Hey, did you see what Sammy was doing? Hey, can you believe they said this? Can you believe they wore that shirt? Can you believe they were there? And then it just starts that gossip and rumor mill and infighting, and it really blows up, which we'll kind of go through here in our hypothetical. So talking about the on-duty conduct, We talked about some of the clothing to express political or social beliefs. What about office decor and cubicle decorations and locker decorations? I remember in the 2016 election, there was a lot of this. And I think that was the first time. By 2020, I think people had implemented some policies. But in 2016, I remember people saying that they had, like, you know, cardboard cutouts of, like, people putting cardboard cutouts of presidential candidates in their cubicle, or putting like signs up for political candidates all over their cubicle. And then someone else who may not have the same political beliefs has to see it all day. And it's very obnoxious, and it caused a lot of infighting. I think a lot of employers have put the kibosh on that as far as those sorts of decorations. Another source of on-duty conduct that gets at that civility issue, gets to harassment, is the internal messaging systems in chat rooms. So whether it's Slack or Teams or Cisco Jabber or Google Chat, employees have the ability to communicate in a lot of ways, and they use these internal messaging systems as that screen they can hide behind to really, you know, take on their online persona, which is not necessarily who they are in person. And it causes a lot of inappropriate on-duty conduct. So many employers will have like a neutral policy, just prohibiting, prohibiting any sort of uncivil or bullying or type of messaging on those internal systems. So it can be a challenge, though, particularly where you have diverse perspectives and, you know, people want to voice their opinions. And when you try to start limiting that, that doesn't make many happy employees either. So it's a fine line to walk of how you deal with that. Workplace safety is a big part of what results kind of in the worst form of inappropriate off-duty and on-duty conduct. A key implication, surrounding the social and political issues that we see today leads to fighting among coworkers in the workplace. And it's not just nasty messages on Slack. It's not just leaving someone a note. It can be physical fighting. And in the worst case, it can be true physical violence. It is not a year goes by that we don't hear about horrible, horrific workplace shootings. And these are things that employers need to be aware of, and just how important workplace safety is. I know a lot of our union counterparts take workplace safety incredibly, place incredible importance on workplace safety as well. Like zero tolerance on workplace safety is usually something that everyone can agree on. So, wrong way. So what does the law say? So we talked a little bit about the First Amendment earlier, what employers can, when does the First Amendment actually protect when does the First Amendment actually protect protect an employee's speech? And while the First Amendment does secure some rights, it doesn't protect private employers, so public employees. They do have some First Amendment rights to the extent that they are speaking as private citizens. So the National Labor Relations Act we talked about. We've talked a little bit about Title VII, ADA, the ADEA, and the federal and state laws. Talked about off-duty conduct and political activity laws, which we don't have those in Ohio. And then OSHA also requires under its general duty clause that employees maintain an environment free from known hazards. It's not the exact language, but that's the general gist of OSHA, which that does come into play whenever we're talking about workplace safety. Does anyone have any questions on the laws? I feel like most folks here probably know all of our employment laws. All right, so how does this impact the workplace? Talked a little bit about how it impacts HR, but it results in a loss of productivity. There are numerous studies showing how how these on-duty and off-duty conduct issues create distraction in the workplace and result in a loss of productivity. That disruption to work is huge, both from a productivity perspective and just employees are distracted, and it's very disrupting. It's mentally and emotionally taxing to deal with a lot of this stuff while at work. It creates internal conflict among employees and between employees and management at times. We've talked about the implications of workplace safety and just general poor morale. I mean, employers can barely keep employees and hire employees. Staffing is huge right now. The last thing that employers want is to be losing employees due to morale issues. And frankly, employees want to work somewhere where they feel valued and you know, where their opinions are heard and where they feel supported. So what do HR professionals do in this scenario? And I'd be curious to see if there's anything that particularly union counterparts think we might be missing here on what HR should be doing. Like if there's something like, actually, they should also be doing this, please let me know. So first, anytime you have an on-duty or off-duty conduct issue, gather the facts. Make sure that you're not just listening to one snippet of what one employee said. Gather the facts, talk to all of the people. They then identify any relevant legal issues and identify if a policy was violated. Does the company even have a policy on it? That's kind of the first few steps there. At some point, the individuals will see if, you know, the HR individuals will see if they need to get legal involved or if the union needs to get involved, and then move on to, is discipline appropriate? And if so, what does that discipline look like? And maybe it's not discipline. What else can you do? So what kind of training could be offered to the employee? What kind of you know, policies should the employer adapt because there wasn't a policy here? How can you help the employee who may have been the victim of some sort of on-duty or off-duty conduct, or the employee who just doesn't understand the common sense approach that we kind of hinted at earlier of don't post that. Policies that most employers have in place, not all employers, but most do, are codes of conduct in general, kind of outlining some of the do's and don'ts. You know, don't sleep at work, do be kind to others, don't bring firearms to work, just the basics. Having a well-written social media policy that doesn't violate any of our public sector or labor laws is helpful. Putting a statement in a company handbook and looking, like, you know, look for a company statement on whether they have any off-duty conduct rules or statements in their handbook. Electronic use is important. That's where we get into the how can someone use the company computer, the company cell phone, the company tablet, or, you know, municipalities electronic documents or electronic instruments. Are they allowed to, you know, is there a direct prohibition on using them for personal use? Is there a direct prohibition on using social media on those and those sorts of things? Does an employer have a policy on solicitations? More employers are adopting these civility statements too, getting back to that workplace civility of a, hey, it may not be illegal, but you should be kind to people. Like, our bottom line is we treat each other with respect. We expect you to do the same. And if you don't treat people nicely, we don't tolerate that either. And then, of course, workplace safety. So when we're talking to employers, we're talking a lot about some of the best practices they can be developing over the last 2 years, kind of reflect on what they've seen and how can they develop new policies. Anytime you're reviewing and revising policies, you know, emphasis on them being neutral, be consistent in drafting an application, and including diverse perspectives. And this is something that employers are still learning to adapt, but and part of it is just the nature of the beast. So, you know, someone from management calls human resources and says, we need a policy on solicitations. So the HR professional gets a policy of solicitation on solicitations, whether they Google for it, whether they draft it themselves, or whether they call their attorney, they get the policy, they implement, they check it off the box. But did they sit down and talk to their employees? Did they involve other diverse perspectives? Because there may be others at the workplace who think differently on what the solicitation policy should be. Maybe it is okay that you let people, you know, Boy Scout and Girl Scout cookies and popcorn are permitted. Maybe that's something that everyone wants. Maybe someone does want to be able to have solicitation so that they can invite their coworkers to a, that they can post about a meeting that they're going to support LGBTQ individuals in the community. Maybe that's a perspective that the company should be considering. So it's something that I know I've seen emphasized a lot in the last 12 to 18 months of, have we considered diverse perspectives in drafting our policies, and how does that change a workplace? So just something to consider. Throwing it out there for those of you on the management side, I know that's something I've seen for the union and employee side of things. That's another thing that employees may be able to get involved in, or make recommendations to their employers that they get involved in that kind of thing. So, and ultimately, promoting mutual respect among employees is the best. We're seeing a lot of new training coming out, supervisor training. I've done a presentation with a peer of mine who's plaintiff side employment counsel, and she and I talk a lot about like what she would do if she was in my shoes and what I would do if I was in her shoes. And supervisor training is so important because it's almost always the supervisor that is that, is that person who maybe didn't have the training that they should have had, so they didn't even know what they were doing was wrong. So supervisor training, huge. Implicit bias training, talking about microaggressions in the workplace, helping people understand what implicit bias is, and that it's not just like a snowflake term. Workplace safety training. I know in the past, 3 to 5 years, there was a lot of active shooter training going on and other workplace safety training. It's kind of gone a little bit by the wayside in recent years, and I think that it's important to make sure that that's something that is on employers' radar, and something that employees are requesting, and also providing DE&I programming. We're seeing a lot more DE&I programming on the employer side of things. We see more in the private sector than we have in the public sector, which public sector is catching up on that as well. And having those opportunities for employees to engage in, productive dialogue, which we'll talk about in a minute. We talked a little bit about expanding EAPs, considering the mental health impact that folks are experiencing as a result of the last few years. Also, just a helpful tip: read your lawyer's client advisories so that you're staying on top of what's been happening, what laws have been changing, what orders have been issued, what other employers are doing, all of those things. Okay, so is everyone ready to participate? Because it is time for our group discussion on my almost Alice in Wonderland like rabbit hole of a hypothetical. But it only works if you play along. So I'm not afraid to call out people, just so you know. All right, so what do you think? Your workplace hosts a DE&I roundtable where employees across multiple generations and experience levels share transparent and honest thoughts about opinions on police reform. David, a manager, expresses his belief that police reform is unnecessary and citizens should simply obey the police. As he put it, quote, "The people who were shot by police put themselves in that situation, and it could have been prevented if they just obeyed. Those people don't have any respect for the law." Megan, a supervisor, brings it to HR's attention because she worries her subordinates are not going to respond well. So again, this is not based on a real scenario that I have dealt with, but I know that those comments have been said in the workplace. So what do you do from each of your perspectives? If you're union side, what's your impression? As management side, what's your impression? If you would just want to respond like as an employee, I would do X, Y, and Z. How do we address this right away? I'm going to say, first of all, who was your host of this DE&I roundtable that this kind of comment even got out there? Which employers should know, like vet who you have doing, hosting, facilitating DE&I roundtables, because they should start with a dialogue of this is a place for us to have a productive dialogue, but we're not gonna go so far as to say people put themselves in a position to be shot. That's a lot. So there's one thing. Anyone else? So another thing that we've talked about and other folks have mentioned is, okay, how do you stop this right away? Like, call David in, discipline David, talk to Megan's team, let them know what has happened, why it happened, how the company is responding to it. Try to contain as quickly as you can, because if you don't contain as quickly as you can, things get a little bit more out of control. So while you're chatting with David about David's comments, 2 African-American employees sound off on social media about David. As it turns out, another employee recorded the comments and the employee posted about it on their personal social media accounts, tagging the company. Now what? Now we've got social media. Are we upset about someone recording right now? I mean, if you have a no recording policy, the employer should probably have a conversation about it, but this is not the time to die on your no recording policy, because you've got a bigger problem on your hands. And you know, are we crossing over into protected concerted activity? My union people, are we starting to feel like this conduct by the employees is protected concerted? They're talking about something that happened at work. It affects their employment. It was their supervisor making these statements. So there may be some violations of a social media policy here if they're tagging the company. Jenny?
When I first read the other one, what came to mind was, okay, he's a racist too, because he used the term those people, considering the majority of the people who have been killed by the police. And coming from my perspective, I know exactly what he means. I think he needs more than just a talking to. I'm talking about David.
Yep.
He also needs to be spoken to about his bias. I'll leave it as a bias instead of calling him just an outright racist. His bias. However, the 2 employees who went on social media might be skirting the line a little bit because they went on social media and badmouthed, I'm assuming, their employer. I mean, it could be looked at it that way by the employer. You badmouth the company. So in that respect, they probably shouldn't have done it. I'm sure a lot of the employees in the room who were people of color, they all got together and had the conversation anyway.
Yeah.
And they were pissed, frankly.
Justifiably so.
But I think talking about it on social media kind of skirts the line just a bit.
Yeah, so I think you hit on 2 good things. Yeah, those people comment was not meant to be understated. I mean, it was very clear what David's intention was in that statement. And I think, you know, David gets pulled off the floor for an investigation immediately pending discipline. I don't think it's just a talking to him. That's a pretty serious violation there. And there is a level of, are these employees skirting the policies? They might be. Like, is there a more productive route to deal with this than social media? Of course. In today's society, this is what happens though. You know, like, I'm thinking like TikTok in particular, there are series of videos of people sounding off at work, going off on their manager, getting on the like intercom at Walmart to tell off their supervisor why they quit and walk out. Like, it is wild. I mean, the stuff people share on social media, that's kind of how people like to do things. Gary?
Well, I have several comments. As I read the first slide, it appeared that David was an elderly gentleman, an older gentleman from a different generation, where people believed and acted as if the police were the boss. And now you're in a round table with people of various different ages. So I think there's bias on everyone's coming from everyone. David just happened to express his. The African Americans the next day expressed their bias, their interpretation of what David was saying. I think there was poor planning on the management not to recognize the difference in ages and when they put the groups together and ask them to discuss the workplace. I think that's a recipe right away when you have people of different ages, different generations, different backgrounds, and put them in a round table. It's just a recipe for disaster because all the biases come out. I don't discipline anybody. I would change the makeup of my round table. If anyone, whoever deserves discipline, is the person that created that scenario, created that situation. And it's like throwing gasoline on a fire, I think. So I think that the whatever was posted, there's got to be a timeout, for lack of a better term, in this kind of situation. What happened was something that management created. And management should take full responsibility for what they created and recognize the mistake that they made. And they may talk to David and the other employees and said, well, let's get something straight here. These roundtables are confidential. We don't want them to be, and then you could, if something happens and someone breaks that confidentiality, then there might be a disciplinary issue. But in this case, example, in my mind, management created it and they're responsible for whatever the outcome is. And unfortunately, it went out there, people of different ages, different biases, interpreted whatever David said improperly. And it should have been caught, especially if Megan is a supervisor, as I understand, she should have caught that term, those people, during the conversation and corrected it at that point. That's why I say, that's why management created this and allowed people to say, they probably told them at the beginning, this is my guess, we're having a round table, speak freely, and David did. And I'm sure the other people felt the same way. They were obviously upset because they went to social media rather than to the boss to complain about David. And I think that type of situation's got to be fixed so that employees don't go to, they have to have an open door policy. You know, you just, if you got a complaint, come to me and it'll be confidential. You know, I advertise myself as a dispute resolution specialist. And I say that I'll come into your business and speak with the employees on a regular basis, confidentially. And just to find out what's going on. Most supervisors don't really understand. They're not trained, for example, roundtables. But anyway, I think I've spoken enough. I'll let somebody else get in there. But I think you got the point of what I was trying to say.
You bring up kind of the point of knowing your facilitator and knowing how you're going to have these conversations is really important so that there can be these kind of conversations have to be very moderated. If an employer is going to promote these conversations in the workplace, they need to be prepared to moderate them appropriately and discipline employees and address the issues as they come up. I agree. They should have done something about it the minute that the comment was said, and it should have been publicly addressed in the meeting, because that would have helped a lot. There's also the assumption, and this is something that Kat and I've talked a lot about when I first did this hypothetical for her. I said, Kat, what was your first impression of who David is? She was like, a white, older man. Yeah, probably has been in management for a long time. And how does our perspective of this hypothetical change if that's not who David is? What if we found out that David, the manager, was a young Black man? Does that change anything? What if David is a bisexual Hispanic man? Does that change anything? Does that change how you interpret what was said? Certainly something to think about, because I do think those sorts of things all play into how people receive comments, and how they interpret them. And I'm not saying any interpretation is inappropriate here, but it seemed pretty clear what David was getting at. Jenny?
Something else to bear in mind too, there was a reason for the roundtable in the first place.
Yes.
As far as the 2 African-American employees who signed off on social media, it's entirely possible, and I might be reading more into it than I should, it's entirely possible that this is not a one-time thing, that these kind of comments have been made before. And when the people who were impacted took it to management, nothing was done. So now you have to have a roundtable. There's a reason for the roundtable. There's a reason for the roundtable.
Excellent point.
So
Yep.
it's entirely possible that any kind of comments like the one David made that had been made prior weren't addressed either. And these 2 employees felt that the only way to bring attention to it was to sound off on social media.
Mhm.
You embarrass your employer, maybe they'll do something about it. I'm
Yep.
just saying.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with you at all. Which gets to like how complicated these issues are. Like it is very rare that these sorts of things are, very black and white to look at. Like there's so many things that are coming in that impact what HR is dealing with in this kind of scenario. So it gets worse. While you were up all night chatting with leadership, you being the HR representative, about David's comments and the fallout of the same, employees were busy planning their response to the situation. When you arrive at the office the next morning, multiple cubicles are decorated with back the blue signs and blue lights. Meanwhile, a handful of employees wearing Black Lives Matter masks, a violation of company policies regarding wearing masks or clothing with any messaging. Kind of talked about this before. You have to look at the employer's policies of what's being violated and what's not. But what would you do at this stage? We're like 24 hours in. It all started with a comment David made at a DE&I roundtable. The whole world knows about it because it's on social media. Now your employees are bringing it back into the workplace with some on-duty conduct of messaging. The hypothetical doesn't say whether there is any policies on decorating office cubicles, but there is a policy with respect to messaging on masks. I'll tell you what I would do. Like everybody's getting called into one big conference room, and we're gonna start talking about this in a big way to say, hey, we need to make some changes. We understand that you're upset, but like I'm probably bringing in a public relations person to help that communication and that dialogue so that we can start to work on resolution rather than more infighting. We're not done yet. As you guzzle another cup of coffee between answering media phone calls with and meeting with the Black at Work Affinity Group, you learn that 3 employees on David's team have staged a walkout and are refusing to complete the critical work needed for a client by close of business. Well, things just got worse. So there are a couple issues here. Number one, if you are the employer in the situation, your HR person is dealing with too much, it's time to start outsourcing. Somebody else should be handling those PR calls. Number two, now we have a potential lockout. So do we have a union? Are they, what will happen if they do walk out? What do you do about the client business and the productivity that's being interrupted? Are you going to discipline these employees who are walking out? Presumably, I didn't have my meeting where I sat everyone down and said, we're all going to learn to play nice and talk this out, because things, or I did, no one listened to me. Wouldn't be shocking either. There's no right answer to this one, except that you need to be thinking about all of the things that happen here. You know, if you are on the union side and you have employees who you understand that they're getting ready to walk out in violation of policy, you know, because they're upset about something that was said in the workplace, what do? You say, go for it?
I think that this is a perfect time for a mediator, not the management isn't going to solve this problem.
Yep.
They're going to have to bring in someone, I think, someone like a mediator to talk to the people, because they're going to hear both sides, and they're neutral, and they're going to try and, as a mediator, I would want to talk to them and to get them to recognize the issue, the problem, and then find out what can we do to fix it. The employees, I wouldn't even have any management there, because you bring management into a meeting with bargaining unit employees, I think there's the dynamics change quite a bit. So I think someone who's not involved in the business at all, such as a mediator, would be, this is in my opinion, this is the perfect opportunity to have.
Well, and I think that's absolutely right. Like, at this point, somebody else needs to be brought in to help deal with this. A properly vetted third party whom you've spoken to the union about bringing in, and the union has agreed, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Not that I'm necessarily saying you need the union's agreement, but I'm saying it'd probably go a long way if you talk to the union before an employer brought somebody in to say, how about we work on some sort of resolution here? So I agree. Time for somebody else to help get involved and to resolve this.
But just before we go on to another thing,
Yeah.
I just want to say, toot my own horn, as they say, I'm a mediator for the AAA. So if you need a mediator, give me a call.
Good to know. Thank you. All right. Just when you think things cannot get any worse, a fight breaks out among the employees during the lockout. Several employees then call the police to break up the fight. Before you turn in your resignation as the HR professional, because this entire sequence has been way too much, now what? If employees are fighting and they are in the process of a walkout, we've got a workplace safety issue. And where workplace safety comes into play, you got to protect your employees who, if you don't have on-site security, you're going to have to call the police to help. Not an ideal situation, though, is it?
What if there is no safety concern?
If there is no safety concern, then I think you wouldn't have to call the police, or you have someone from management go talk to the police as soon as they get there, explain the situation, that everything seems to be fine. We don't have any safety concerns. We understand some of our employees called, but you can sit out there in your cruisers if you don't need police on site, right?
Right. I may have missed this is Bruce Thompson. I may have missed it, the very first portion. I'm having a little sound problems, but I guess it also depends on if there was a union or not in that particular work
Yeah.
Being that I'm a union advocate, that there are certain members that cannot, go out on strike in a union. So those who are permitted to go out on strike, where's the, I don't think there's a safety issue there. And the only issue I think I could make conjure up would be if they want to pinpoint it to one person and call it a work stoppage. But I don't see an issue with striking when there may be issues with the working conditions itself. But I'm sorry, I'm just coming in because I missed part of it.
Oh, no, it's okay. I think you're right. I mean, there are so many issues at play in these types of scenarios, and the hypothetical was developed to be a little bit of an Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole. How bad can things get situation? But many of these things happen in the workplace individually or sometimes combined. And thinking about how would you deal with this from every angle, helps us all kind of troubleshoot and expand our perspective of it. Yeah, Jenny?
I think it all goes back to what I said before, that there was a reason for the roundtable in the first place. And I think the lesson is when you have employees that come to you with things that are said that shouldn't have been in the workplace, you deal with them at that moment and you make sure your employees know that you've dealt with it at that moment, that you didn't let it fester because you were ineffective or inactive with any complaints that come to you. It festers because you let it go so long. And it's entirely possible, like I said, I could be reading way too much into this. It's entirely possible that people just got fed up, which is the impetus for the roundtable in the first place. And I haven't really seen it in this scenario. It didn't state that David was dealt with any fervor. Sometimes the employees need to see that this person who offended so many people in the workplace was not dealt with any fervor. And so once again, you've kind of let it slide. And it kind of, I'm from Southern Ohio, took the rag off the bush for a whole lot of people. Okay. It just took the rag off the bush for a whole lot of people that got pissed because it could be that they don't feel like their concerns and their lives and their beings are being addressed with any respect.
Annie, hi,
Yeah.
this is Kelly Miller. After I've listened to each slide get worse, and I argue you need to put more slides that say guzzle more coffee. Other than that, one thing that, coming from a union perspective, so I am a union advocate for education, teachers and education. So a couple of things that I would have wanted to look differently is I think that we often assume of people's abilities to communicate. And from the very beginning, I think that needed to be addressed. So if you're going to bring in a DE&I, you're going to have difficult topics. In fact, that's kind of the heart of what you are doing. And so I think that the first step is not to assume that people know how to communicate in a way on a topic that's going to be divisive in itself. I think we're seeing that play out right now is how many different people feel strongly about something and can no longer even be at a family get together. And if we see that within our own family units, then this is also happening in our workplace. And so I think that even going back to the very beginning and having some grand idea that we're going to do a round table, someone didn't realize that there are skill sets that must happen before you even step onto that round table. And we need maybe some sentence structures. We need some, I don't know if safe words is exactly what I mean, but if someone says something, they need to have a phrase, have some already pre-created. I am uncomfortable when you say that, when what you just said makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then put the period there. I mean, there's gotta be some training on how we have those conversations before we got into that roundtable. And then the next thing that I just wanted to say was, and then when that training breaks down, we should have already had a plan in place. The assumption needs to be at some point, someone is going to say something very difficult. I mean, we need to just assume that's going to happen. And then say, okay, when that happens, what procedure is in place? Now, is that always going to work? Absolutely not. Someone's still going to get pissed off and put it out on Facebook. And that is inevitably going to happen. But I think that, you know, the more you have, what is the next agreed upon step? So when this happens, we agree that we will have a meeting within 24 hours. And then you need to make sure you do that so that it's not a buildup to, well, we said that 3 times in a row, we never have it. Now we're just taking it to Facebook. So I think not only accountability in the process, or transparency in the process, but then the accountability must be there and the company has to be consistent in it. And I think that those are just some key features way in the beginning. And I'm not living in, I mean, you're the one who said it's Alice in Wonderland, so maybe it is a bit naive, but I also think that some people will avail themselves of that. And if the goal is to have things like this happen less often, as opposed to never, if the goal is less often, then when someone gets ticked off, how many of your employees might have followed the policy? And then what you have is outliers instead of there's no agreed upon course. And I think that those are some things that could lessen this from being more prevalent in a company as opposed to what happened here.
Yeah. Completely agree with you.
Annee, I just want to state it's 1 o'clock at this time. I don't know how many slides you have to go.
I just have one slide that says, that's who I am. Find me. You can find me, or you can find Kat. And I just appreciate, you know, your participation today and going down my rabbit hole with me and having some good discussion and thinking critically on how kind of these on-duty and off-duty conduct and social media things really play out in the workplace and how we approach them and how we can all do better. So.
Well, Annee, I want to thank you for this presentation. It's very, very informative because when I was looking at the slides, I'm saying, well, at this level, I can see somebody imposing discipline. At this level, I see somebody else imposing discipline. I see somebody else imposing discipline. But in your scenarios, what you end up with is, hey, we might need to have a conversation prior to discipline to try to correct this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely discipline happening here. Like, don't get me wrong, I think there's definitely discipline, but there's a lot more that comes out of this than just discipline. There are conversations, there's, you know, there's a lot.
So thank you, and we will be sending you our Colera mug for this presentation. I also want to remind our participants this Friday, we do have the sessions on contract interpretation as well as past practice. Our speakers are arbitrator Sherry Passmore and arbitrator Elizabeth Wiesman. So I welcome all of you to register for that event. That should be informative as well. And I'll see you Friday or Tuesday of next month. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Good, Meta.
Take care.